Hello everyone and welcome to another Fusion 360 Tech Thursday. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk and wanted to welcome you to today's topic. We're going to be talking about lofting. I'm going to be showing you how I went about creating this part here, and this is actually from a mostly printed CNC machine. Let me bring up a picture of it here. In fact, one of you on the live stream in a previous live stream mentioned this, and I'm like, okay, I got to make one of these. So we're actually going to be creating one of these feet you can see here in this image. So let me jump back in here. I also have helping me out today. Aaron is helping me with the chat window. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to throw them out there. What I want to talk about today is how do we go about creating this particular shape. And you'll notice that it's kind of curved here from the side, and it starts out as a square in the bottom, but it ends up being a circle on the top. And you might think, well, maybe you could just revolve a shape around, but because it's square on the bottom and round on the top, we're going to have to use the Loft command. So let's dive right in. I've also included the drawing in the description of this live stream. Now this isn't the most perfect drawing. I just kind of whipped it out pretty quick, but hopefully there's enough information here to allow you to try and recreate this particular part. Okay, so the first thing, I'm going to be in millimeters. So I'm going to confirm that I'm in millimeters, which I am. And then I'm going to start by creating a component. So I'm going to click on the new component. And by the way, I'm using the latest version of Fusion 360. We just had a new update come out. I'm loving it. It's great. And so if your screen looks slightly different than mine, it's probably because you haven't updated yet. So I'm going to create a new component, and let's just call this bottom corner is the name of the part. Now, why am I creating a component? I'm only doing a single part right now, but down the road, I might want to include this in an assembly, where I bring all of those parts together. So that's why I created it as a component. So, okay. Then I'm going to start by creating a sketch. And I'm going to do the top plane. So I'm basically going to start by drawing my rectangle. So I'll click on the rectangle command. And if you don't know this already, it puts the options of the different kinds of rectangles over here in your sketch palette. So for example, if I do C for circle, you'll see all of the different kinds of circles here. So R for rectangle, I can see my 2-point, 3-point, and center. I'm going to go ahead and do a center rectangle. Now all of the dimensions I'm typing in, I'm getting off of the drawings, and I'll switch back and forth between the drawing every once in a while. So it says it's 53 millimeters square. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 53 in both of those, and we can see that it created a rectangle. Now, just for your reference, right here, it says 53, and I put the little square icon. So that means it's 53 in both the horizontal and the vertical dimension. Now, in a previous live stream, I mentioned that I keep my sketches fairly simple. For example, I don't do fillets in 2D, I do fillets in 3D. But in this case, we're actually going to be lofting from one profile to another. And so I need my profile to look the way I want it to be before I do the loft command. So I am going to actually use the fillet command. So I'm going to say fillet. I'll select my 2 lines, and the fillet, according to the drawing, is 7 millimeters. And so I'm just going to hold down my control key and kind of continue clicking around. And of course I get a phone call. Let me go ahead and select these other lines here. So I'm doing a radius 7 all the way around. And now I'm done. I'm going to finish my sketch. So what we basically did there was we drew the overall shape of the bottom. So you can kind of see how it's a square bottom with filleted edges. The next thing I want to do is draw the shape of the top, which in this case is just a simple circle, which is 35 millimeters in diameter. I'm not going to worry about the hole through the middle quite yet. We're going to come back to that. I'm basically building the overall shape. Okay, so I need to, actually let me jump back to the drawing, sorry. I need to draw this circle at the correct height, and we can see here that the overall height is 40 millimeters. So I need to create a sketch that's 40 millimeters from my rectangle. So to do that, we're going to use a construction plane, and the very first one is called offset plane. I'll do the offset plane. Allows me to pick a plane, and then I'm just going to start to drag, and you can see how it's basically going to create another piece of paper that we're going to sketch on at a particular height. And in this case, I want it to be 40, so I type in 40 and say OK. And if I expand open my component here, we can see our sketches, and we can see this construction. Okay. So then what's cool about this is I can just select that plane. I just click on it once, right mouse click, and it shows me the commands that make sense. I could create a sketch on that plane, or I could offset another plane from that. But in this case, we're going to say create sketch, and I'm going to draw my circle. Now, I started at the 0, 0 because this is going to help me out. I'm just going to go ahead and click there, and now I can type in my diameter of 35. And if I say finish and rotate, we can see that that circle is now above this other sketch. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the loft command, but you're going to see some issues happen, and we're going to come back and continue with our sketch. But under the create menu, I'm going to pick on loft. Okay. What this allows you to do is to specify which profiles you want to loft. And you'll notice as I get near this profile, it kind of highlights. I'm going to go ahead and click on that one. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on this one. And you can see that Fusion did what I wanted it to. It took this square shape with rounded corners, and it moved it up, or lofted it to this circular shape. Okay. Now, the problem with this is, if I look at it kind of right from the front, it just went in a straight line. And in our example, it's got a curve to it. We've got a nice transition. And in this case, we don't see that. And that's why we're going to actually have to add in some guide rails. And what this allows you to do is actually tell it, go from one shape to the other, but follow a rail. Kind of like a train has to follow a train rail. The loft is going to have to follow that rail. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you some cool commands in here. Up here at the very top, you can see the different profiles, and it says connected. But I can also say direction. And notice what we get. We're actually kind of controlling the weight of this loft. So I can sort of simulate that curved surface. So if you don't really care too much about the exact shape of this, you just want it to go from one shape to another and kind of curve, you can use direction instead of connected. And basically what you're doing here is you're specifying how tight of the weight is that. So you can see it goes straight up for a long time before it finally starts to curve over. And that's because we have a pretty strong weight right there. But if I bring that down, you can see how it curves a little bit smoother. Okay. I can do the same thing with a second profile. I'll say direction, and we get this. It's kind of the same result. You can kind of see how we can change the weight of this and make it go from the square quickly to the circle. So that's what those options are. Now in this case, I'm going to leave it connected, and we can see that it's going to keep that straight edge, which is not what I want. Okay, so we're going to create some guide rails. So I'm going to cancel out of here. And basically what I want to do is to specify how they're going to loft up. What rail is it going to follow? So I'll go ahead and create another sketch, and let's just do it maybe on this front plane right here. And I'm going to use a spline for this. Now, if I get near this line, you'll notice it catches to the line, but it doesn't catch to the end point. And I want to be very specific to catch to the end point of these. Okay, on this one it does, but on this one it doesn't. So we're going to project some geometry. So I'm going to come in here and say project. I'll click on this edge here, and I'll click on this edge here and say OK. And now you can see those little round icons. And what it basically did is it projected the very edge of this circle onto our piece of paper. So you can kind of see, if I kind of turn it from the side, there you go. Okay, so I projected this sketch information onto my new sketch. And now if I get near there, you can see how it's going to snap to that corner, and that's exactly what I want. Okay, so I'm going to click maybe one point there, another point here, and then finally down here to kind of define the curve. And when I'm done, I'm going to click that little green checkbox. Let's just zoom up a little bit. You can see when you create a spline, it shows you the endpoints, which are these black dots. And then you also see these green lines. And these are our tangency weight and our tangency direction. Okay? Now, I want this to go basically straight up from this edge. I'm going to purposely make it kind of at an angle here. So I'm going to click on that tangency line and click on horizontal vertical. And now you can see that that tangency line is straight up and down. So that means the spline is going to come straight up and then start to curve. Okay? So I have the shape the way I want. And I could come in here and move this point around. I could tweak it a little bit. But I like the way it looks right now, actually. And I want this to be on the other side. So I'm going to use the mirror command. So I'm going to say mirror. It's asking for the object. But now it's asking for a mirror line. And you'll notice I don't have a line that I could mirror around. If I did this one, it would kind of flip up. So I need to create one that's onto this, basically the vertical line here. So let's go ahead and create a line. I'm just going to get near this center point here, and you can see it creates this snap guide. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a cyan line right there. So basically saying I'm lined up perfectly with that point. And I'm just going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to kind of come up above and click. So basically we're going straight through the center of this part. Now, I don't want this to be an actual object line, so I'm going to click on it and say construction. I apologize. I have my email and everything turned off, but for whatever reason an email popped up and I see people like, what was that? That was an email, so I apologize. I'm not sure why that showed up. Okay, so I turn this into a construction line. You can kind of think of this as a light pencil line. We don't want it to be an object line like a circle or a rectangle. We just want it to be a reference, like a light pencil line. Now I could come in and say mirror. What's the object? I'll say this line here. What's the mirror line? That guy there. And we can see that sure enough it's going to mirror this across. I'll say OK. And you'll see all of the icons saying that they're basically a mirror of each other. I'm going to say finish my sketch, and we can see that we now have this guide curve on both sides of these circles. Now I'm going to do the loft again and show you an issue. So I'm going to say, let's create a loft. What's the profiles? These two are my profiles, and we get that nice straight representation. But this time I can come in here and say, I want to add in a guide rail. So I'm going to click on this curve right here and watch what happens. It's kind of interesting. In fact, let me look at it right from the side here. So it's taking that shape and following it up this rail right here. And that's exactly what we want. But you'll notice this little kink right here, and that's because it's having to kind of pull the profile over as it's lofting up. So you can add more than one rail. So I'm going to add in that second rail, and we can see how it's going to follow that, and it's going to follow that there. However, if we look at it from this side, it's more kind of a straight line. So when you're creating lofts and you want to follow a very specific profile or path, sometimes you might actually need to create a path on every single side. So for example, 4 sides because of this square shape. Again, it kind of depends on what you're creating. If I was creating, for example, like a whiskey bottle, it could be just an elliptical base with a round top, and then I would just have one guide rail kind of showing the side of the bottle, for example. But in this case, I need to actually add in some more curves here. Now here's a neat trick. I'm going to go back to my sketch, and I don't have any dimensions on this or anything like that. I just went basically by the shape. Now it would be very difficult for me to recreate this spline on another sketch, because who knows where that point was or anything like that, because I haven't dimensioned it. So what I'm going to do is actually just select these lines, right mouse click, and I'm going to say copy. I can actually copy sketch entities. So I basically copied that into my clipboard. Now I'm going to come in and create a new sketch. Oops, didn't mean to do that. I'll say create a sketch. I'll say on this front face here, or the side face I should say. And then I'm just going to right mouse click and say paste. Now in my case it came in kind of upside down for whatever reason, not sure why, but I can rotate it. Now here's the catch. Notice where this little icon is, where it's going to allow me to rotate it, and it's going to rotate around that point. Well, I want this to be very precise, so I'm going to have it rotate around the center point because I know that's symmetrical. So I'll click on this set pivot, click on that point, and you can see how this little triad moved from over here to right here. Now, the one thing you have to remember is when you're done with that, you have to say, hey, I'm done. I've set my pivot. So I'm going to click on that checkbox, and you can see how it goes away. But now when I rotate, it's actually going to rotate around that middle point right there. And I say rotate 180 degrees. I'll say OK. And we now have the exact lines all the way around. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my sketch, and we can see how I was able to recreate. So I basically drew one of them and then mirrored it. Then I selected both of those, copied it, and then pasted it onto a new sketch in a totally different orientation. So now I know that those are correct. So let's go ahead and do our loft. I'll say loft, our profiles. I'm going to add in some rails here. So I'll say this rail here, that guy there. Let's rotate around. And sure enough, we can see how if we hadn't added these, it wouldn't have matched. But now I can come in and add that one and that one. I'll say OK. And I've just created a loft from a square shape to a circular shape. Okay. And it's nice and smooth. You can kind of see how it's blending the fillet out into this large circular area here, so we get a really nice representation. In fact, I probably should have shown this at the beginning, but I've already 3D printed it, so we can kind of see this is what the final product's going to look like. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to start adding in some of the details, like the holes and the slots, etc. Okay, so the next thing I might do is put the major stuff on first. So there's a big hole that kind of goes through the middle of this. So let's create a sketch on that top face. circle command. And again, because I started kind of at the origin, everything is symmetric off of this, so I can select that middle point. And this is 22.5. I'm sorry, 23.5 according to the drawing. Okay. Now, in some of my previous live streams, I've talked about sketching, and I've gotten questions in the chat and follow-up emails where people are like, do you sketch everything on one plane and do a kind of a complex sketch, or do you do multiple sketches? And I personally like to do kind of the multiple sketches, and we might run into a situation in this example, and I'll show you why I like to do the multiple sketches. So, I could have put this circle on my original sketch that was on the bottom and then extruded it up. But I don't know. I kind of like to keep these separate sketches so that way I can go back and find them easier. So I'm going to select this and say extrude. And I'm going to start to drag down. Now here's a neat trick, okay? How far do I need to go? Well, according to the drawing, it's 40, right? So I could type in -40. Or I could just hover over this face right here, and you'll see that it says snap to -40. So if I were to click on that face right there, I don't even have to rotate. It actually knows you're trying to go to a planar face. You'll see that it will snap to that -40. Or what I like to do is, instead of saying distance, I like to change it to all. And what that's going to do is go through all of the part. And what's nice about this is, if I were to come back and change this in any manner, like change the height, for example, it's always going to go all the way through the part. Whereas if I had said only go 40, and then let's say we added 5 more millimeters down here, it wouldn't have gone all the way through. So this is another tip. I personally recommend selecting all. And there you can see how it's going to go all the way through. Okay. Okay, the next thing I want to do now is maybe start working on kind of the slot feature right here. So according to the drawing, that slot sits on a shelf about 5.5 millimeters up from the bottom. So again, we're going to use an offset plane. So I'll come in here and say offset plane. I'll grab that bottom face, and we're going to drag up a little bit, -5.5. And it just created a plane that's exactly 5.5 millimeters from the bottom of the part. Okay. Let's go ahead and sketch on here. And I'm just going to draw basically one of these. So again, using the drawing, I'm just grabbing some dimensions off of the drawing, but I want to be very precise. I want to be exactly in this corner. So again, I'm going to create some geometry that's going to help me out. So I'm going to just start with a line, and I want that to be at 135 degrees. I don't care how long the line is. I just wanted to make sure I'm basically 45 degrees from the center. Again, I can select on it and click on this little construction icon right here, and it turns it into a construction line instead of an actual object line. Okay, then I'll come in and start creating my slot. And I'm going to do a center to center slot. I'll just get kind of near this edge here, click and click. I know the overall diameter is 4.85. And I purposely, created this a little bit larger than it needs to be in length. The diameter is correct. I got that off the drawing. Now I can come in and start to tie this thing down. So for example, I know the distance between these 2 points, I'll just go ahead and place my dimension, is 2 millimeters. And so we can kind of see how this slot got smaller. And then I also know that from here to here is 25 millimeters. Let me printed it out pretty small. 26 millimeters. I need my glasses. 26 millimeters. And so you'll see how it moved that slot into the correct location. So again, I just kind of get it on the line where I want it. I don't really care about what size it is. Then I can come back and start to tie it down with some dimensions. There's also a larger slot that kind of goes around that. So I'm going to do the slot command again, center to center. And now I know I can click those 2 points. And in this case, the diameter is, according to the drawing, 14. And I'll show you where I got this from. And there we go. We can actually see that this overhangs slightly, but that's actually how it's designed. So how did I do this? So basically I used this detail view right here. So we could see that it's spaced 2 millimeters apart. The diameter of the slot is 4.85. And the diameter of the larger slot is 14. And we can see that it's 26 millimeters from the center of the circle. So that's where I got that information from. So I'm only going to do one of these. I'm actually done with my sketch. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And I want to extrude this smaller slot all the way through the part. So I'm going to go ahead and try and click on it, and you'll notice that it's kind of buried by my part. So it's trying to grab, this front face first. So I've shown this tip a couple times now, but I use it all the time. I absolutely love it. If you click and hold for about a second, you'll see that it allows you to kind of probe through. So the very front face, then it's like almost like a laser shooting through it. So the first thing lasers are going to hit is the front face, then the profile, and then the bottom face. So again, all I have to do is just click and hold with my left mouse button for about a second. I'm going to grab that profile. I'm going to right mouse click because all of the commands that make sense are at my right mouse click, so we can see I could extrude this. So I'm going to say extrude. And I'm going to start to drag. Now I want it to go through both, so I'm going to come in here and say symmetric. And instead of distance, I'm going to say all. And notice what it does. It goes a certain distance in one direction and a certain distance in the other direction to go all the way through. So again, that all is a very handy command. And obviously we want to cut, so I'll say OK. And we just created that slot that goes all the way through our part. Now you'll notice my sketch disappeared, but it's very easy for me to come back in here and just turn that back on. In fact, you'll notice I usually have my sketches and my construction folders kind of unfolded so I can see and get in there very quickly. Okay, so now I want to do the same thing with this larger slot. So I'm going to click and hold and pick on the profile. I'm also going to select this inside profile here. So I'm basically saying I want to remove all of this material. Now I don't have to do that, but just for me personally, it's confirming that I'm going to be cutting everything away. I mean, for example, what if our extrude had a 1 degree taper or something like that? It would create these weird sliver faces. But in this case, I'm saying remove this whole region, this whole area, all at the same time. So I'll right mouse click and say extrude. I like to start to drag. We can visually see that sure enough, that's going to cut some material away. How far? Let's just say all again. And it figures out how far it needs to go all the way through the part. And I'll say, okay. And sure enough, it removed all of that geometry. I'll turn off my sketch, and we can see that we got that kind of neat little pocket area. Now, I only did one of these, and I actually want to pattern these around, but I'm actually going to add in a small fillet. So let's go ahead and say fillet. Make sure I want to, let me tangent chain. I'm just going to grab that edge there, And according to the drawing, it says all fillets are 1 millimeter unless otherwise specified. So I'm going to type in 1 millimeter and say OK. Now you might be saying, well, I've watched some of your previous live streams, Brad, and you've said, save your fillets till the end. Do the major stuff first and then do the minor stuff at the end. But what you're going to see here is we're actually going to pattern not faces, but we're going to pattern features. So we're going to pattern the slot, the big huge extrude, and the fillet all at the same time. So it's going to save us some time in the long run. So check this out. I now have my finished corner here. I can come in and say create a pattern, and I want to do a circular pattern. And right here you'll see by default it's usually set to faces, and I could have come in and selected all of these faces, but I run the risk of missing one or making a mistake. Okay, so I typically like to pattern features, and features are what's in your timeline. So for example, I could pattern the fillet, I could pattern that big extrude, and I could pattern the small slot all at the same time. So I actually selected all 3 of these features. In fact, you see it says 3 selected. What's the axis? We'll select this cylinder as the axis, and it gives us a preview. By default, it's set to 3. Now I want to change this to 4. So I'm going to up that to 4, and now you can see how it's going to go in the corners. However, according to our part here, you'll notice that there is not one in this corner here where the slot is. So we're actually going to only have 3, but there's an option in here called suppress. And you'll notice that it's checked, and all of these have a little checkbox next to them. So I can come in here and uncheck one of these. So we're still patterning 4 quantity, but we're only going to display 3 of them. I'll say OK. And very quickly, we created these little slot pockets all the way around the part, except for over here where we're going to do the nut and bolt where it kind of connects. So that is why I actually did the fillet before I did the pattern. So we were actually able to pattern that fillet feature also. Kind of handy. Okay. Hopefully this is making sense and you're learning stuff. I can see lots of questions in the chat, and Aaron's busy typing away, so I appreciate your help there, Aaron. The next thing I want to do is to create basically this region right here. So what it is a screw is going to go through there and be tightened down by a bolt, and it's going to pinch onto some circular tubing. So we can kind of see that it's going to be about 14 millimeters wide, and we can see that in the drawing, the hole that goes through is 3.75. Now, what's going to be interesting is I put a dimension here that says 7 millimeter diameter, coincident with edge, but I also threw a dimension here, and this will make more sense once we get creating this. But I want this hole to be in a very specific location, but I also want it to be coincident with this edge here. So let's go ahead and take a look, and if I turn on my origin, we'll see that I don't have a plane that's in the correct direction. I need to be going across here somewhere. Okay, so I want to be able to create a plane. So I'm going to come in here and say plane at an angle, but this requires through an edge or an axis. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and say axis through a cylinder. So I'll go ahead and click on that cylinder, and you can see how I'll put a line down through there. I'll go ahead and say OK. Now I have a line that I can select plane at an angle. So notice how it's asking for a line. I can click on this line, and sure enough, it's going to put a plane through that line, but I can specify what the angle is. So you can see how we can rotate this plane. And let's just go 45 degrees. So we're now slicing through our part at 45 degrees, and that's exactly what I want to do here. I'll go ahead and create a sketch. And you can kind of see our part looks a little bit different because we're looking at it kind of in an orthographic, direction. Now, here's another tip. I want to project some geometry. So I'm going to say project. And I want to project this curve right here, but you'll notice when I click on it, it actually does not project that edge. Okay? It projected the top and the bottom and some of the other geometry, but it doesn't project that edge. And that's because of the direction that we're facing here. So I'm going to undo and show you, instead of project here, we're going to say intersect. Now let me show you before I do that what's going to happen. So this piece of paper is slicing through our part right here. Okay? And I want to come in and say project, intersect. And notice here it's asking for some geometry. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this geometry, and you can even kind of see the preview there. It's going to project whatever's intersecting through that plane. And now it did create that edge, because I used the project intersect. So very handy command. Most people use project, works in a lot of situations, but in this case, intersect is actually quite useful. Okay. Okay. So let's go ahead and let me just look at it straight on. I'm going to go ahead and draw my circle here, and I'm just going to draw it out here in space. And then I start to drag it into location. So I know that this is 3.75, and then there's a larger circle that goes around it, and it is 7. Okay, and then I'm just going to get this sort of where I want this to go, something like this. Okay, now I gave a measurement of 10.5 down, but I also want it to be a coincident. So what I'm going to do is to create a point. And you'll notice I can create a point on this line. So I'm just going to click somewhere on that line, and that point is now on that line. Then I can come in and say, I want my circles and that point to be horizontal with each other. So now watch what happens. When I drag this point, you can see how the circles are staying in line with that point, and my point is staying on that edge, which is kind of handy. Okay, and then the last thing is I want this to be coincident with that point. So I'll come in here and say coincident, that, and there we go. So we basically know that this circle is cutting through this edge, and it's in line horizontally. So basically this is like the center of the circle on the edge is what's happening here. So let's go ahead and throw our dimension on here. So I'll say from that edge to that point, and that needs to be 10.5. So watch what happens. That point slides up the edge there a little bit, but it still is coincident. So I know that my circle is exactly where I want it to be. And I know that was a lot of information there, but basically I want this little tiny bulge right here, and I want it to be perfectly lined up 10.5 from the top. Okay, so I now have my sketch. So again, things are buried. So I'm just going to click and hold, and we can see I can probe through and grab that profile, and I want to extrude that profile. I'll say symmetrically through all. Okay, we can see how that's going to extrude or cut through our part. Okay, I'll say okay. My sketch went away, but again, just hit the little light bulb right next to it. And now I want to start creating a little bit more stuff to be removed. So I'm going to click and hold this profile. I'll grab this profile here also. Make sure I grab both of those. I'll say extrude. And again, I'm going to slice through. Now, notice this is an object line. So here's a catch. This is an object line, and so it did not grab all of my profile. I only grabbed a little part of it. I need to grab that guy also. And I'm going to say, let's go all in this case. Let's say okay. So I'm basically building half of this, and the reason for this is, and it's going to be hard to see, but I actually have, I'll show it over here. We're slicing through a round profile on one side, and then we're actually going to create a recess for a nut to get trapped in there. You can kind of see it in this preview here. So we're going to put the head of the bolt through here and then the nut over here, and it's going to help keeping it from turning. So I'm going to basically build half of this at a time. So I use that profile to machine through, and I grab the larger profile to give me that bigger recess. And then finally I want to add in kind of this section here to give it some meat to bolt against. So let's do that again. I'll come in here and grab these two profiles. I'll say extrude. And let's go to the left. And according to the drawing, it's 7 millimeters. So it's 14 total. So I'm going to come in here and just say 7 millimeters, like so. And say okay. And so I've created that side. Now, this side over here, I want to do that hexagon shape. Now, what I'm about to show you is what I mentioned earlier on, where I said I like to do multiple sketches because sometimes you might run into a situation where you don't get the results that you would expect. Instead of doing one complex sketch, I like to do multiple sketches. And what I'm about to show you is the exact reason why. Okay. So I have a sketch right here, and I'm going to go ahead and say edit sketch because I want to add some more stuff to it. So I'm going to say edit sketch, and notice what happened. My hole has gone away. Now, why is that? Well, that's because the sketch is way back here in time. So I'm down in my timeline. You can see that there was 3 steps after this sketch. So it's not showing me those 3 things. And I personally like to see what my part looks like. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. As soon as I say finish sketch, I see all of this information. So because I came back and edited this sketch, it's not going to show the downstream features that happened after that sketch because we've gone back in time, right? Okay, so how do we get around that? Well, I can just come in here and say, let's create a sketch on that face. And that sketch is now created after this other stuff. And now I can visually see everything. And again, this is personal preference. But I kind of like to see what's going on here. So now I can come in, say polygon, and I'm going to do a circumscribed polygon. I'll click here. I just have to get near this edge right here for the correct diameter. I'm just going to go ahead and click and finish my sketch. Okay. Now, I can go ahead and notice also, because this is on a separate sketch, it's not bringing in this circle for me. So it would have split this into multiple little sections. So another reason why I like to do multiple sketches instead of one complex sketch. So let's go ahead and extrude this guy. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Here's a neat trick. I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself here. What I'm about to show you I think is really, really handy, and I haven't shown this in previous live streams, but I'm going to show how you can actually extrude from an offset. So check this out. I'm going to extrude this circular profile first of all. So I'm going to click and hold to grab that profile and this profile here. Okay, and we're going to extrude that the 7 millimeters, just like we did on this other side. So I'm going to come in here and type in 7, and we want to, instead of cut, we want to join. Okay. Now the interesting thing here is my hexagon shape is way back here. We're going to figure that out here in just a second. But I now have created this main shape. Now I want to extrude my hexagon profile, but it's kind of in the wrong location. But check this out. I'm going to say extrude, and I'm going to start to drag. Okay. And I'll change this to all, and you'll see that it'll slice all the way through, but I don't want it to destroy this whole region right here that I just created. So that's where this start comes into play. So you can see it says it's going to start from the profile right there. Or I could say offset. How far do we want to offset? 7 millimeters. So what it's doing is it's using this profile, but offsetting 7 millimeters and then doing the extrude. And this is a really kind of a cool trick. And like I said, I don't know if I've shown this before, but it allows you to, instead of having to create another sketch on another face or whatever, you could have a more complex sketch right here and then offset it 7 millimeters and then do your extrude. I'll say okay, and we end up with this particular shape, which is exactly what I was looking for. Okay. So the last thing we need to do for this part is to create the slot that goes through it, because it basically gets pinched together around, some circular pipe. So we can see that that slot is 1.5 wide. So I'll just jump over here, and you can't see it, but remember we created that plane on this axis? Well, I'm just going to come over here and turn it back on again. It's still there. We can still use it. So I'm going to click on it, right mouse click, and say create a sketch. Now, what shape do I need this to be? Well, it can be as simple as a rectangle. So for example, I'm just going to get near the center line here and just do a big shape like that. We'll click on it. We'll say extrude. Now I want to go symmetric in both directions, so I'm going to say symmetric. And I know that the overall length, or the whole length, is 1.5. So when you change to symmetric, it gives you this measurement option of half length or whole length. So right now it's set at half length. If I typed in 1.5, this is actually 3 millimeters, right? Because it's going 1.5 in one direction and 1.5 in the other direction. However, if I change it to whole length, you can see how that got smaller. And now it's 1.5 for the whole length. But notice how simple of a profile we used, right? We're just trying to create a slot through there. So I just used a rectangle. I'll say okay. And we're pretty much done. The last thing, if you want to, I could come in here and say, fillet, for example. Now these are 0.5. So I'm just going to grab a couple of these edges to kind of help smooth the transition, from this part to the surface there or whatever. And I could put a fillet on this top edge here if I wanted to. 1 millimeter fillet. Oops, type in 1. And it'll blend on the top. And I'll say okay. And there we are. There's my finished part. Not an overly complex timeline, but we used the Loft command to create that shape going from a square to a circle. Okay, I'm going to point out a couple really quick things here. Let me jump into one of these sketches. Something we just added, and I've seen this in previous live streams, is they wish that they could turn off dimensions. Well, guess what? Now you can actually turn off your dimensions. So I should find a more interesting sketch or whatever. Yeah, for example, this guy here. Let's turn off the body so you can kind of see what's going on. I can come in here and turn off my constraints, and I can turn off my dimensions. So it really cleans things up. So I don't know if you've watched Aaron's video where he talks about what's new in the latest release, but if you haven't, I highly recommend you go out and watch that. I hope he's already linked to it because there's some really cool stuff in that video. And I'm actually going to be highlighting some of that in upcoming live streams. So with that, I hope you found this live stream beneficial. Make sure you subscribe, leave comments, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever you think. Let me know other topics you want to see. I've been getting some emails from some people requesting some topics and stuff. I love seeing what you're all doing with Fusion, and I hope to see you on a future live stream. Thank you.